Priscilla tells the story of Elvis, but through a lens that we've never seen before. With Kaylee Spaney and Jacob Elordi at the forefront, this adaptation of Elvis and Me is so uncomfortable but necessary that it'll have you leaving the theater questioning why you haven't heard about this story more. The film also feels so anti-Elvis that his own estate wasn't a fan of the movie, stating that it feels like a college movie. On that note, the movie only comes in at a $20 million budget, and after my screening at the New York Film Festival, they talked more about the budget, but while I was watching the film, I never saw any dips in the production, but rather the story that they were able to tell as a whole. Before I get into all of my thoughts on Priscilla, if you've seen or want to check out this movie, let me know what you guys think about it in the comments down below. But without wasting any more time, let's get right into it. I had to start off with this story because it takes place from when Priscilla was in high school to Priscilla and Elvis's divorce, and there's this weird, ever-evolving chemistry between the two actors and actresses at the forefront of this film. And I'm going to talk about those performances in just a second, but I think why the story feels a little bit odd in terms of how they present it to you is because there's really no act structure with this movie. It's a biopic. It only comes in at an hour and 50 minutes, and I'll talk about specific pacing problems that I had later in this video, but I just think as a whole, this movie wasn't really set up to be the best runtime wise. Again, you're fitting all this under 2 hours. You're trying to tell a fairly long story. And on top of that, there's the aspect that you have to balance how dark and really uncomfortable this film gets. I do have to get into these performances right away because Kaylee Spaney and Jacob Elordi are absolutely amazing in this movie. I want to start off with Kaylee Spaney because obviously she's at the forefront here, and for a big reason. This is Priscilla's story. Again, it's taking place from when she was in high school to when her and Elvis were getting divorced. So there is so much time and so many different versions and honestly different mindsets of a character that she has to go through. At the press conference at the end of the New York Film Festival screening, she said that before lunch she was one age and after lunch she was pregnant with a kid. It's so uncomfortably great how her performance is executed in this film. But now obviously we have to talk about Jacob Elordi as Elvis because I knew nothing about his preparation for the performance, but he gives such a great underlying performance here, something that isn't too flashy, just an undertone of who Elvis is. And I like that for two reasons. Firstly, it's not obnoxious, but secondly, it actually allows us to be told the story of Priscilla without having Elvis always taking over. The inherent comparison is obviously going to go to Austin Butler, and I think that Jacob Elordi and Austin Butler's interpretations of Elvis are completely different because they're in two completely different stories. Firstly, Priscilla has an hour and 50-minute runtime, and Elvis has 2 hours and 39-minute runtime, while also being the fact that Elvis is the main character of last year's movie. Priscilla is the main character of Priscilla. And this is also basically an anti-Elvis movie. Elvis isn't supposed to be glorified in this film. Elvis isn't supposed to be this big pop icon. We're supposed to see the opposite side of Elvis. The one that we saw Austin Butler play, obviously there were negatives and we did see down parts of his life, but that's not what a lot of the film was based off of. So again, it feels really like they're playing two completely separate characters. Jacob Elordi's accent though is really great. Again, very underlying, nothing too out there, nothing that's like I'm experimenting with this Elvis voice. It's just a little hint of Elvis and it works. In terms of other characters, I think every side character really just holds their own. The story itself, especially in the first half of this movie, is just weirdly uncomfortable because you know Elvis is much older and Priscilla is in 9th grade. It's bad. It's a bad one. My entire audience, it was bad. Like everyone was uncomfortably laughing, but they do a great job of balancing the humor and the uncomfortability of this story, and I think that's why it wasn't like a pain to get through. But kind of switching gears here, I definitely want to talk about, like I mentioned earlier, how this movie was made for only $20 million because I think so much of the set, the settings, everything is beautiful. Again, the movie was made for $20 million, and in a press conference after our screening at New York Film Festival, they mentioned that everything was built practically and they filmed it in 30 days. Obviously, this makes a lot of sense with the 1 hour and 50 runtime, $20 million. The producers were talking about how it was really difficult to just get this film picked up in general because obviously it was going to be a pretty anti-Elvis film. And the movie was a lot of different things. Obviously, it is an adaptation of Elvis and Me, but there are a lot of different elements in terms of just being a study of Priscilla, a study of Elvis, and a study of their relationship. But runtime wise, this does make a lot of sense, and I really like that they put a lot of effort into a lot of these smaller things. They couldn't get access to all of the stuff that the Elvis movie from last year was able to access because this movie didn't have the permission from the Elvis estate. They were only able to see things that were open to the public and with that interpret what it was actually going to look like. I think they did a stellar job with interpreting because all of it at least felt real to me. Speaking of how they filmed it though, I definitely have to get into the pacing of this movie because as you can tell, I like this movie a lot, but I think the pacing is the biggest issue. I think this movie gets way too tight during the end of the film. It tells so much story through the 1 hour and 50-minute runtime. It definitely feels longer than that just because they're covering so much ground. It never feels longer than that in a bad way though, because they're consistently moving. They're consistently giving you something new. They're either moving to a new time frame, a new interesting story, a subplot. Something interesting is always popping up. But once you get to a certain point in that third act, and you can tell at the very end when they're trying to wrap it up, because everything speeds up to 1,000. And when I mentioned the fact that it kind of speeds up in the third act, really, the final bit of this movie is the only time where you can tell any level of structure because as a biopic goes, this movie just tells and tells and tells. It gives you more and more and more of a story, and it never really feels like it goes back in terms of trying to just keep it in a structure. It's telling you a story. They don't care how they pace it because they know that by the end, there's going to be a little chunk where they just speed it all up and get to the end, which I don't mind, but again, I wish this movie was longer. I wish they had a higher budget. I wish they had more playing room with this story because there is so much more that they could have told, I feel like. And the final thing I want to talk about is a little bit more on the anti-Elvis side just because I found it interesting how they went about making this movie because we obviously know that the Elvis estate doesn't like this movie. They also weren't allowed to use any Elvis music, and I really like that idea because obviously they wanted to use Elvis music at first. They tried to get permission to do it, but what makes it more interesting to me is the fact that the producers were really open to talk about how it ended up being a good thing that they couldn't use Elvis music because it leaned them more into the Priscilla side of the story. It's not an Elvis movie, it's a Priscilla movie. Elvis is just a character. I find this really interesting because anytime Elvis's name is in a sentence, a paragraph, an essay, whatever it may be, he is the main character. You never feel like Elvis is just mentioned somewhere. He's always the topic of discussion, and this film really feels like they just push Elvis to the side. Obviously, he's a very big supporting character. He's definitely second on the call sheet, but they understand where their focus is, and you see that in the production of this film. Overall, I really enjoyed this movie. I think it's a story that needed to be told, and they told it in an absolutely awesome way. I'm gonna give Priscilla a solid 8.5 out of 10. Definitely recommend checking it out when it hits theaters. If you've seen or want to check out Priscilla, let me know what you guys think about it in the comments down below. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Peace.